crowd of hecklers.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's sustainability seminar. My name is Nancy Holm. I'm Assistant Director here at ISTC and organizer of the seminars with Beth Mashesky, who's here. And today's the last seminar in our sustainability series for this fall. And we'll begin our seminars again in February. So you can stay tuned, and you're probably all on our email list to get those announcements. But if you're not, we have a sign-up sheet out in the hall there that you can sign up to receive the notices. And anyone listening online can contact me at naholm@illinois.edu to be on our list. So in case you haven't, sometimes cannot attend the seminars in person, we do broadcast live each of our seminars, and they're also recorded and archived on our website. So we have over 120 seminars from the past 8 years on the website on different sustainability topics. As we begin today, I'd like everyone here in attendance, please silence your cell phones. And I also wanted to mention that we're going to hold the questions to the end for the speaker. And then also for those listening online, we'd like you to type in your questions, and we'll answer those also at the end of our presentation today. So we're very pleased to have as our speaker Dr. Mark David, who is a professor in the Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences Department here at the U of I. He's been on the faculty here since 1985. His primary research interests are in the areas of water quality and biogeochemistry, in particular the biogeochemistry of nutrients in agricultural, forested, and aquatic ecosystems, including transformation, transport, and effects of nutrients in agricultural and aquatic systems. Mark received his bachelor's degree in forest science from Penn State University, his master's degree in forest biogeochemistry from the University of Maine, and his PhD in environmental science from the State University of New York. Today, Mark will be discussing the nutrient loss reduction strategies for Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Mark.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Well, thanks for attending. So I can make this really short. The answer is improvement, we hope. So any questions? We can move right off. I'm going to talk about, some of you may be familiar with this, but I'll give you a little background. This has been a big thing going on in the state, is developing what's called the nutrient loss reduction strategy. It's something that's been going on for about 3 years now. And this is something that all the states along the main stem of the Mississippi River have had to develop during that time period. And in our state, it was led by the Department of Ag and Illinois EPA. I led a group on campus here who did the science assessment, which is about half the document. And this was a very open process over a several-year process period. And there was a public draft released January 24th. I'm sorry, it was released last November, about a year ago, and there were 60 days for comment. There were about 1,000 comments, so most of those were form letters. And then it's been revised, and it was officially released on July 21st of this year. So we're now sort of operating as a state under this strategy. But I want to back up a little and sort of talk about why we had to develop it and how we got there, and then I'll go through the science assessment and then talk about what we're actually doing as a state. So a lot of this is driven by local water quality, and that means either the nutrients in streams and rivers in Illinois or lakes, reservoirs, and also the biology, fish, macroinvertebrate impacts. And so you're always going to hear two parts of this. Again, the local, and also local involves drinking water supplies. And of course, a lot of drinking water supplies across the upper Midwest have nitrate problems. You see Danville, or Decatur and Danville are the two places that have nitrate removal facilities in Illinois. The big one right now is in Des Moines, and Des Moines is suing drainage districts in Iowa. That's caused quite a lot of attention, I would say. So the local is both quality in the rivers and streams, but also from a drinking water perspective. The other big one, of course, is the hypoxic zone that forms each summer in the Gulf of Mexico. This was the measurement that was done the last week of July in 2015. And this is a problem that we've known about for some time. It's monitored this 1 week period, usually at the very end of July. And I'll show you how that compares to past measurements. It's a little hard. This is the Mississippi's coming out here, and the currents transport the water and the nutrients to the west. And so that's the Texas-Louisiana border. We'll come back to how big that was this year. We've known about this since the 90s. And in 2001, we had an action plan. And the action plan said we're gonna go at this. We're going to reduce nitrate down the Mississippi by 30%. We're going to get the hypoxic zone size down to 5,000 square kilometers. And this is how we're going to do it. Of course, this was how we're going to do it is a voluntary approach. And so that went on for a few years and didn't get us very far. So we had a new action plan, 2008. It said, no, 30% is not enough. We need 45% reduction in nitrate plus the 45% reduction in phosphorus. So we kind of upped the ante and also said that we would do this by, 2015, right now. So we didn't make it. So federal EPA, who kind of directs all of this, kind of said, well, we didn't make it. We're not going to make it this year. So on February 12th, they extended it for another 20 years. So that gives us a little more time. And we should, in the meantime, and these are their exact words, to track progress and spur action, we should aim for a 20% reduction in nutrient loads by 2025. And so that's what we're operating under right now. So it's pretty interesting to me as the sort of environmental scientist to have a problem that clearly was identified in 2000, and now we've given ourselves 35 years to try to reduce it. Which tells you something maybe about how severe the problem is. This is the size of the hypoxic zone. It started being measured in 1985. It bounces around depending on how much flow there is in the spring down the Mississippi River, how much fresh water, how much of the nutrients are transported. There's our goal. Here's what 2015 was. It was on the larger size. It wasn't the largest, but it was on the larger side. There's the 5-year average. Clearly, the goal is to have that 5-year average be down below this bar, and so we obviously haven't made much progress on that. So that's that. So again, setting up these nutrient reductions are two things. Again, the local biotic integrity of streams and rivers, drinking water, and then this downstream Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. So something came out in 2011 called the Stoner Memo. Nancy Stoner, who's since moved on from EPA but was the acting assistant administrator, came up with this guideline that said states need to come up with clear plans on how they're going to meet these targets of 45%. You don't have to read this, but it has 8 points that had to be developed. That's what's in the strategy. If you read our strategy, it meets all 8 of these points. From monitoring to what you're going to do for point sources, ag areas, you name it. It covers everything. So that's what really forced the states to develop these strategies. So again, as part of the strategy, we did what we could call the science-based assessment, which was to do 3 things. What are the current conditions? What are the nutrient sources in Illinois, and how much of the nutrients are leaving the state? How could we reduce them? What methods are available? How effective are they? And then the third one, how much would it cost to do this? And so we had an economist on our team. So this is 3 figures. The top one here is just, if you add up, what we did is we used data for all the major rivers in the state. There's 8 of them. And then we could expand that to include the whole state. And and the USGS gauges the flow on those. And if you add up the flow, this is how much water leaves the state each year. And of course, it's variable. There's the 1993 flood year that everybody remembers, or a lot of people remember. 1988 drought in here. But it bounces around. And that's a really important factor because that's the #1 thing that determines the nutrient loss, is how much water there is. And so then the bottom 2 are what we're up against. This is the total amount of nitrate It averages about 400 million pounds of nitrate leaving the state each year. That is a large amount. You'll see it in perspective in a little bit. And about 36 million pounds of total phosphorus. And you can see how they're bouncing around. There's no real trend here through time. You can't say it's getting worse. These go back again. This is 1980 through 2011. But that's the backdrop of are like leaving the state of Illinois and what the 45% would be measured against. In terms of the sources, if you look at the whole state, we're different than many of the ag states. On one hand, nitrate is dominated by agriculture. It's about 80% ag. The rest is mostly point sources, which are, again, sewage treatment plants primarily. It's not all sewage treatment plants, but it's mostly. And then a little bit of urban runoff. Phosphorus is actually split evenly. Half from, we're a big ag state, but we're one of the most populous states in the country. So because of the Chicago area, we have a lot of phosphorus and sewage effluent. And so that leads phosphorus to be about half and half, agriculture versus point source. Of course, the point sources dominate the Illinois River because of Chicago's 8 million people on the other end of it. So it's not evenly distributed across the state. These are the 8 rivers just to show that variation. And you can see for phosphorus, particularly, so this is nitrate, phosphorus again, the total, this is the average over a multi-year period. And you can see how phosphorus really dominates the load in the much smaller in the other rivers. But of course, the Illinois is the dominant part of Illinois and has most of the nutrients. For the nitrate, it's still mostly agriculture. One of the things that's unique, maybe not the great word, but we have really high concentrations compared to most states outside the ag belt. I mean, if you take the average concentration of nutrients leaving the state, 3-4 milligrams of nitrate and 0.3 to 0.4 milligrams of phosphorus. That's a lot. If you go to a state that's mostly forested, these numbers would be 100 times lower. So we have lots of nutrients in most of our rivers, which is part of the challenge. If you take our load and compare how much actually goes to the Gulf of Mexico, this is what you would get for nitrate. And on average, 20%, and as John pointed out in the News Gazette, the new president of the Farm Bureau, or no, corn growers pointed that out. He actually used that number and he used it correctly. 20% of the nitrate going to the Gulf on average is from Illinois. The other big state is Iowa, and then the other states, Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana. And about 11% of the phosphorus. You can see how it bounces around each year. I mean, some years we're almost a third. In a dry year for us, we may be less than 10%. Iowa's right up there with us. And who's first each year? We're probably 1 and 2 each year. Depends where it rains more, which one of us is going to be the winner, if you want to say that. So we're a big part of the nitrate story for the Mississippi River Basin. And again, so that's 20% of, and we're only a small part. You know, think of the size of the Mississippi. It's huge, 42% of the United States, and we're only a small part of it, but yeah, we're 20% of the nitrate. So this is going back to the earlier figure just to point out that's the reduction we have, 15-year average or so. That's our target. It's going to be hard to get to that. Nobody expects it to happen quickly. The idea would be down, and on average, over time, that we'd be below those lines. I mean, that's the goal of this strategy. We also did things on a finer scale. That was all at the state level. We also looked at about the 50 small watersheds. These are Huck 8s, but this is nitrate, both point source, non-point source. This is to get an idea per acre of land, where are the nutrients coming from? So the unit here is nitrate in pounds per acre per year. And this is point source, so you see that it's the Chicago area, the highest ones. For the non-point source or agriculture, it's the upper 2/3. Southern Illinois contributes very little nitrate because it's not tile drained. And if you don't know what tile drainage is, I'll explain that. Most of you probably do. But you really see that this upper part of Illinois is the high. And right here where we are some of the highest nitrate concentrations. We're up over 25 pounds per acre per year on average. This is phosphorus. It's a little more distributed. Phosphorus has different transport, but again, the Chicago area, this is downstream of Decatur because of the ADM food waste that gets into the Decatur sewage treatment plant. It has some of the highest phosphorus concentrations. It has the highest phosphorus discharge by far in the state of Illinois. Whoops, let me get back to that. And then here's the non-point insertion. You see it's shifted. It's more of the hillier areas because sediment contribute phosphorus. So it's when you get down to the western parts of Illinois and southern Illinois become more important. Down here it's a little less because it's forested, but in here the flatter areas tend to be lower in phosphorus. The other challenge with phosphorus, whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Let's see if I can get. Okay. When you get up, the challenge for phosphorus is we're talking about very little loss per acre. And nitrate may be 20 or 30 pounds per acre. We're only talking about a pound or so, which is really hard to reduce that amount. So we were able to rank these watersheds with the nutrient loss, and then the state used that and other information like watershed groups, sort of general interest, where data is available. And these are now the priority watersheds in the state of Illinois for both the ag groups, the point source community, everybody sort of focusing on to say these are where we're going to start and put the largest effort initially. And so they include some that are phosphorus driven, some that are nitrate, and you can see that that's what the legend says. Some that are kind of both, but instead of tackling the whole state right off, this is sort of subdividing a little bit. So again, just to back up, Illinois is a very modified state. We've channelized all the ditches. We've put tile drainage in everywhere. We put new tiles in all the time. Now where we used to have people with a shovel, you can put in a whole field in a day with some of these very expensive machines. We used to put in tile what we call random that went to wet spot to wet spot. Now we put in patterns that may be 60 feet apart, 80 feet apart. The laterals, and you can see them here. That's a newly tiled field. Drive around this time of year, you'll see lots of fields that have gotten tile drainage. It works. Tiling a field, draining the water table, draining it more than it was, improves yield. There's no question about it. And what you see in a ditch then is just a pipe, a solid pipe. The pipe in the field is obviously perforated to allow the water to get in. But if you walk in any of the ditches around here, you'll see the outlets. And of course, that's a really nice transfer. We put fertilizer often on as ammonium, sometimes as a nitrate, but it all ends up as nitrate. And nitrate, if the water's moving and the nitrate's there, it tends to go with it. And so that's why the tile drained region has the greatest losses of nitrate anywhere in the U.S. And these are the really big losses, and that's the method. So it does a good job for water, but it does an equally good job for nitrate. Surface runoff's the other problem. We have a lot of bare soil at this time of year, probably more fall plowing that just occurred than we'd like to see. And surface runoff carries sediment. And when you have sediment being carried off, you also have phosphorus bound with it. Phosphorus can also move through tiles. That's actually a big problem in the Lake Erie, Ohio watersheds right now. We don't have quite as high concentration in tiles, but tiles are a part. But by overall, the surface runoff is the major way that phosphorus is lost. Especially on days like this winter time. It was January a few years ago where the soil's been partially frozen. There had been lots of fall fertilizer put on of what's called DAP, diammonium phosphate, which is often broadcast on the surface and hadn't really been incorporated. And when the water ran off on this, we called it actually the day of the DAP. We published a paper on it because we saw ammonium phosphate concentrations in every river around here at some of the highest concentrations we'd ever seen. So one of the problems is that on conditions, anything you put on can end up in the river. So the other thing we did is we had to look at all the agricultural practices in the state, and we did this by using the NRCS's major land resource areas. There's a bunch of these for Illinois. A lot of them are pretty minor, and so we grouped them into 9 of them. And it's a way of looking at sort of areas that have the same kind of topography and soils and farming practices in different parts of the state. And this was a way of compiling all the data that we were going to use. A little simpler than, better than the count using individual counties, but not being too finely broken up. And so these are the 9 that we ended up with, and that's the description of them. And we looked first at how many acres, where are the corn and soybean acres. We have a little bit of wheat, but we're really a two crop state. We also had an estimate of how many acres were drained. So we have about 22 million acres of corn and soybeans in Illinois. About 10 million acres are tile drained. That's our best estimate of those. And you can see it's just a few of these that are really tile drained. We're in this one right in here. Little other information there. We also, one of the big things that comes up is this is just an over-fertilization problem. And one of the things we tried to do then is estimate how much fertilizer was being used, plus manure, and also made manure estimates. This is the row crop acres, and then this is the nitrate loss. We were able to estimate how much nitrate N was lost per acre of row crops. You can see these vary from southern Illinois being pretty small, 3 or 4 pounds per acre, all the way up to, this is a weird one. This has contacted me multiple times. That's the driftless area up around Galena. And that's this karst limestone area, and they have a lot of animals, and so but it's pretty unimportant in the scale of the state, but it's a unique area. But anyway, we went through this whole analysis. We did this whole corn fertilizer kind of thing, and the bottom line is, if you look at what the current recommendation system says, for the most part, and that's this maximum return to nitrogen system, we're not that far off. In other words, there was no evidence based on the best data we could get that it's not to say fertilizer couldn't be cut by some people, and in fact we included that, but there's no evidence of sort of gross over-application of N that a lot of people often want to point to. Again, we were able to break the nitrate losses even further into, that's the total per row crop acre, but we were able to look at tile drain versus non-tile drain, because this becomes really important when we start applying the practices. If you apply the practice to a non-tile drained acre that doesn't lose very much, you're going to have, it's 30% of a small number is a small number, 3% of a bigger number is going to be, you're going to get a better effect. And so we were able to separate them, and you can see that some of these are pretty big. For the nitrate per tile drain acre is all in the 20 to 40 range. And we've measured these in tiles. We know that is pretty accurate. In the non-tile drained, it's much lower, generally less than 10, with the exception of that Galena area. So that's the basis. That lays out by these 9 areas what the loss is per acre. We know how many acres there are. The next thing is then, well, how do we, I just wanted to emphasize these 3 are the big and where we place most of the effort. We also did look at phosphorus management and fertilizer application, manure application of phosphorus. We have a fairly large hog population or production in Illinois, but overall we're not a big animal state. We're nothing like Iowa. Our animals are more on the western side of the state, and manure turns out to not be very important in Illinois. What's really important in Illinois is corn and soybeans on tile drain land for the most part, or sloping land in southern Illinois. And we used some data to look at erosion losses. We have a transect survey that's done on, I think, 10,000 points every 2 years in the state. We're able to get that data. And what we find is that despite all our efforts, and remember, NRCS, and before that the Soil Conservation Service, was all formed in the 30s to help reduce erosion. We've gone a long way at reducing erosion, but if you drive around Illinois in the spring, what color are the rivers? And that's due to erosion. And so there's still a lot of erosions, particularly in southern Illinois, and we were able to estimate how many acres were eroding above the sort of the T, which is the theoretical replacement rate, which is typically about 5 tons per acre. We used some work that we had done earlier on Lake Bloomington. We looked at Iowa, which was ahead of us in doing the strategy, to come up with, basically we have to pick a number. So if we take a practice like constructed wetlands and say we put a wetland at the end of a tile, how much nitrate does it remove? Well, we know it's variable. It's going to vary, how the flow is that year, what the load is, temperature. But in the end, to make this work, we have to pick a number. And so a lot of us who are doing this have worked in this area. We looked at what Iowa picked. We looked at what we've used before, and we came up, and you'll see the numbers. For wetlands, we came up with 50%. And we know that's going to be an average, but to do this kind of analysis, that's what you got to do. You got to make, at some point, you got to say, all right, this is this effective. We did the same thing for phosphorus. These are the different strategies. I'll come back to the strategies here in a second. So the way we broke the strategy are 3 groups that you can think about. With fertilizers, manure in the field. The industry calls that the 4 R's right now, which is the right source, rate, time, and place. They're really pushing that program with dealers, with farmers, to try and get that message out that there's a right way to do all that. So that's actually sort of tinkering with fertilizer in the field. But that's not going to do it. That can help, but that's not nearly enough. The other is other infield management techniques. Cover crops are the one everybody talks about. That's one of the ones we looked at. Drainage water management is stopping up, raising the water level in the tile when you're not growing something, so basically backing up the water and holding it. Buffer strips are just that, along streams, having grass or forested buffers. And then actually just changing the cropping system to a perennial. That would be another method. Then there's the either edge of field or off-site measures. So bioreactors are wood chip, beds of wood chips at the end of tiles that can help remove nitrate very quickly. Again, constructed wetlands. A saturated lateral buffer is where you take the end of the tile and you put a T in it and you direct flow of a new tile line along the ditch so that the water flows out through sort of a buffer area then. And then 2-stage ditches is actually reconstructing ditches. These are, and they get progressively more expensive as you go through these. I mean, that's really re-engineering the ditches in tile-drained areas. It's been tried in a few places. But again, that's sort of the range of things that are out there right now. So again, we took the practices and applied those to each of those MLRAs. Again, that's a bioreactor being built where the water will come in, flow out, run down the bed, and then come flow back out again. But you're trying to get rid of it, the nitrate, by denitrification, put it back to N2 in the atmosphere. And wood chips stimulate microbial activity, so you try and do it really fast. Another way, again, is constructed wetland, where the water flows in, and in the sediment that you get denitrification as well. And then here's just a picture of a cover crop just on the field to the northeast of here. Again, that's just some aspects of it. The economists came up with how much each of these costs per acre to do some of these kinds of things. Some of it is, all right, if you're going to switch to fall to spring, a lot of our nitrogen is applied in the fall in Illinois. So if we were to switch it to the spring, there's cost to that. He estimated $18 an acre. You can see some of these other costs. We'll come back to these, and these are all posted if anybody's really interested. The only negative cost here is reducing the rate. So if you add less fertilizer, you save money. So that's a negative cost. And that's, we just said, look, 10% of the acres probably apply too much. I mean, that's just a guess. And because again, the data didn't show any systematic large-scale over-application, but we know some people do. And so we just picked that and so that comes out to reducing the N rate by 20 pounds and saves about $8. So you can see some of that, and the cost can get pretty high depending on what you're doing, but then they may have a bigger effect. We also had things with phosphorus that really save money, And two of those are reducing tillage. If you till less, you have less erosion. So if you till, it's money because that's less diesel fuel, less equipment cost. Another one, this one surprisingly to me came out to be one of the more controversial things. Everybody in the industry, everybody would say, farmers, you got to do soil tests, particularly for phosphorus. And one thing soil tests show is probably half the acres in Illinois, based on a soil test, don't need phosphorus fertilizer. In other words, the phosphorus test says you got plenty. So we figured, well, for at least 3 rotations, you could probably eliminate a P application on those acres, draw it down the reserves, and that ended up being at minus $15 an acre. This has had a lot of pushback, surprisingly, and because a lot of land is leased, and a lot of the leases say, if Bob's going to lease my land, I want him to put back everything he takes off. And so if he takes off 60 pounds of phosphorus, even if my soil test says I got plenty, I want him to put it back. And that's some of the, you get into those dynamics, and that's what you get to the real world of trying to implement some of these. And then a lot of phosphorus is just spread on the field over the surface, and this would be to incorporate it. So these are just some examples of those. We also looked at point sources. We didn't just do agriculture, and in fact, I sort of became I guess a junior economist. Gary Schnitke, who was our economist, taught me how to do the analysis. And one of the things you would do, this is the first time you're going to see this, what we end up doing to put all the costs on the same basis, we figured out how many dollars it took per pound of N or P reduced, amortized over a 20-year period. Because you got to remember, some of the practices, like a wetland, you build a wetland, it costs a lot the first year, but it's going to work for 20 years with nothing else then. You do a cover crop, well, you got to pay for that every year. Sewage treatment plant, they're going to have to spend $100 million maybe the first year, depending on the site, if it's one of the Chicago ones, but then they may not pay anything, after that, or there may just be some operating costs. So by doing this cost analysis, we put everything on this dollars per pound. Again, think of that spread over 20 years. So for example, the cost for phosphorus, most sewage treatment plants in the state average close to 3 milligrams of phosphorus in their effluent. To get them below 1 would cost approximately $13 per pound of phosphorus removed. Phosphorus is always going to be more expensive because we're talking about a smaller amount. For nitrogen, the cost was $3.30 to get nitrogen down to 10. It probably averages 15 or 16 right now in effluent. So these aren't sewage treatment plants going to zero. These are just some reductions. So this gets a little complicated, but I'll spend a few minutes here. So this is the way we built our analysis. So we start with the infield, and here's the practice. Here's our baseline. Again, 410 million. That's how much nitrate we're losing. First, we assign what's the reduction per acre. Remember I said we had to pick a number. So for example, we assume cover crops are 30% effective at reducing nitrate loss. Reducing the N rate is maybe 10%. Going from fall to spring varies from 15 to 20. Northern Illinois is 15. Around here is 20 because it's warmer. So that's the first thing. Then we can say, well, if we did that on 10% of the acres, or if we got rid of all the fall to spring in the state that we know of, how much would each practice individually reduce the nitrate loss? And you can see some of these are, they're all millions, but 2 million, 4 million. So if we put a cover crop on 10 million acres of tile drain land, we would get an $84 million or an 84 million pound reduction, which is 20% of the baseline. So again, remember our goal is 45%. These are individual. You can't sum them here because if you do one, it may affect another. But this analysis was to say, well, how much of these, how effective are they? And some of these are pretty small. Putting an inhibitor, which reduces ammonium going to nitrate in all fall applied in, well, it's maybe 1% if we could get the rest, because a lot of the fall end already gets inhibitor, and not all acres get fall end. And so when you start taking all of that into account, that's how effective, or that's the reduction you get. And then this is then the cost in dollars per pound. And you can see they vary from negative all the way up to maybe 11. Here's a big difference. The cover crops on tile drain versus non-tile drain, very different because there's much less to reduce on the non-tile drain. So that's the infield. This is the edge of field. So here we just kind of making up. We said, well, we put a bioreactor on half of all the tile drained outlets in the state, just as an example. Whoops. They're maybe 25% effective, so that's 8.5% reduction. It's pretty cheap. Wetlands on 35%, another one that's pretty effective. And then buffers. Buffers don't really work for tile drained regions, but buffers are on here because buffers really work for phosphorus. And there is some nitrate reduction for some water, not the tile water, but so that's why this says reduction only for water that interacts with the active area. That actually becomes pretty cheap. We looked at, well, if we know perennials work really well, we probably underestimated. We gave them a 90% reduction. I actually now think they're more like 99. But if we used to have a lot more pasture and hay acres, about 1.3 million acres more in the 80s, if we put that back, so it's like the last in to row crop, if we took that back out, what difference would that make? And you can see, well, it's 3% or so. It's expensive because you don't make as much money from hay or pasture. And then if we just put perennials on 10%, just to show that that makes even a bigger effect. And then finally, here's the point source for if we went to that 10 milligrams per liter, it's only about 3%, because remember, point sources aren't that big of a source of nitrate. So this gave us a couple things. One, it shows the different costs per practice. It also says that, geez, there's no one thing that gets you there at all, right? We're trying to get to 45%. The biggest individual one is 10 million acres of cover crops on the tile drained area, and that's only at 20%. So this says it's going to take a lot of these practices, and it's easy to see why. Most of these aren't 45% effective. They're less. So that means it's going to take multiple things to get us there. So that was the nitrogen analysis. We did the same thing for phosphorus. Some of these are, again, this is reducing erosion, the rate reduction. They're actually pretty big, and they're pretty big negative costs. So tilling less and adding less fertilizer could have big benefits and save money. Cover crops become very expensive per pound reduced, but something like cover crops helps for both N and P. Something like a bioreactor only helps for nitrogen. So we can take that into account in the final analysis. The other one I want to point out, though, here is the point source reduction. That actually is big. So if the major point sources in the state, and there's like 180 of those, were to reduce their phosphorus to just 1, that's 22%. I mean, that's almost half the goal right there. And that's probably the thing that's going to happen first, more than anything else. So again, there's clearly no one other than that. None of the ag ones there's some big ones, and the cost can be quite high. It can be up to hundreds of dollars per acre. So the last task then was this was with spreadsheets that got really complicated. And again, we weren't prescribing anything for the state. We're saying this is how it could be done. If we combine all the practices and take into account that if you have less fertilizer, you have less coming out the tile. So if you had a bioreactor at the end, it has less to treat. This is what we end up with. A whole range of practices. It takes a lot to get to, say, 45%, and the cost is about $800 million a year for 20 years. So $16 billion to get us there for both N and P. The one I left at 35%, 45, was just to show that getting that last 10% of nitrogen was really expensive. Really, really expensive. Because we used up all the cheap practices, and we had to go to the more expensive ones to get that extra 10%. We also did look at, well, what would it take to get to the 20%, and it's a lot less. Again, this isn't the cost of ag. That's about $200 million of the cost is for point sources. The rest is agriculture. You have to remember is this includes the negative costs, and if we didn't have those in there, it would be even higher yet. So if you basically say it's about $1 billion a year, that's actually the same number roughly that Iowa came up with, so which they have comparable land areas to Illinois. But again, it takes a lot. You know, bioreactor, getting rid of everybody using the right rate, all nitrogen in the spring, bioreactors on half the tile lines, no pea fertilizer, where the soil test says you don't need it, reduce tillage, cover crops on all acres, all 22 million acres. Point source reductions, that's what it takes to get there. So it's, part of the difficulty of this is corn and soybeans are a leaky nutrient system, and we're trying to do this and keep in corn and soybeans, and that's one of the biggest challenges. So just to summarize, we included all of these practices that I mentioned. We didn't include these two. We think there's some problems with this drainage water management, and we think this is a really good one, side dressing fertilizer, but there's no real good data on how effective it is, so we didn't include it. But we've been telling people, yeah, you know, if you're a farmer, you can do any of these things, whatever you want. So one part of this analysis, it says there's no one practice. It says everybody needs to do something. Probably every acre needs some new practice aimed at nutrient reduction, and you can get there any way you want. So we're at the point now where we need to do it. And point sources have already started. Chicago, the reclamation district up there, has voluntarily said they will reduce P to below 1 milligram. Some of those plants up there are some of the largest in the world. And so like Stickney, if anybody's been to the Stickney plant, them reducing to 1 or some of the other big ones, that's a big reduction. I have to admit that the various groups like the Farm Bureau, Corn Grower Association, Council on Best Management Practices have really gotten behind this. They like it because it's voluntary, of course, but they've embraced it where as little as 16 years ago, you know, basically they tried to run me out of the state, I guess you could say. They now are embracing that, yes, nitrate in particular is our problem and we have to do something about it. So things have really changed. They tax fertilizer and basically are funding projects to further evaluate these practices. And the whole idea is strategy that will be updated periodically. Again, it was released on July 21st, so it's just getting underway. This is the Illinois Farm Bureau website. They have a whole page on this. I'm on 2 videos that they featured. They had something called the Roadshow in May and June, or June and July, where they went to, I think, 15 different places in the state to sort of roll out the strategy and say, you know, they're basically saying to farmers, now this is our chance to show we can do this voluntarily. And they say that right here. This is Illinois Agriculture's opportunity to prove that voluntary conservation does work. So they've taken this pretty strongly. This is mostly through Illinois EPA, but there's all kinds of tracking that's going to be done. Mostly we don't have good systems, but these are obviously the point sources are tracked because everybody who's a point source has to have a permit, so they can be tracked. These are grant programs that give out money for practices. There's these different surveys. They're talking about what more information we need to know that things are changing. There's monitoring programs. There already are monitoring programs, but we have something new. I was really pleased to see this because I first came up with using these 8 rivers back in 2000. And I suggested, well, why can't we have continuous monitoring on those? And so we have something called the Statewide Nutrient Export Loadings Network, which is on the 8 major rivers. That's the Green Rock, Illinois, Kaskaskia, Big Muddy, Little Wabash, Embra, and Vermilion. So there's 8 of these red dots. These are called superstations. They now have continuous nitrate and phosphate sensors. And anybody can go look at the data. They also had continuous flow. But Illinois EPA is paying several $1 million for a 5-year contract. So we're all some of the best. And in fact, this just came from another meeting where this is being copied now by other states across the Mississippi, upper Mississippi Basin. So in other words, we have continuous monitoring so we can see if the loads are changing. We'll be able to make better estimates of the loads leaving the state, and over time we hope to see them going down. So to have those there's new these sensors are expensive. They're $15,000, $20,000 a piece, but they do allow for continuous monitoring of those two nutrients. There's all kinds of groups that came out of that. The Nutrient Monitoring Council is literally meeting right now, so that's where I was earlier. Their charge is to document the loads leaving the state, the conditions in the critical watershed. There's, you can see some of the other names. There's, these are the ag groups meeting. There's the urban stormwater group. There's a group that is to develop nutrient standards for Illinois, so sort of what the phosphorus or nitrate concentration limit should be. And then the overall group is called the Policy Working Group. And you can just see they've all been meeting. So there is quite an impressive level of activity going on right now. The key is what that actually leads to. So this is my last slide. So will it work? And that's sort of the question, I guess. Those reductions are large. And to really do them, there's not $1 billion a year coming from anybody that's going to be available. And it's voluntary. I would say both point sources and ag need to make this happen, and they have to make major changes. I would say at this point, everybody's committed to doing this, more so than I probably would have ever expected to see at this time. And monitoring will tell us. I've given a form to this talk more on the ag side to a lot of ag groups, and you can imagine the number one question I get is, how long do we have? And it's how long do we have till we're regulated? And they're scared to death of regulation, and so because right now I say, well, this is your chance. You know, this is a voluntary program. This is the time for ag to show that, yeah, we can make some changes. I don't know that anybody's going to hold everybody to, if we didn't, we got to 43%, that's a failure. I think if we just show that the line is trending down over time, that's what we need to do. But that's where we're at right now. So this document is to be sort of almost a living document and be updated periodically. There's biennial reports that are to come out that will talk about how we're doing, essentially, both in terms of the conservation practices, the point source permitting, and what the water quality tells us. So that's where we're at. It's been an interesting 3 years to see this get developed, and like I said, it's as much as I could ever imagine. I would say everybody is committed to doing it right now. So with that, I'll stop and I can take some questions.
Okay. Thanks you very much. I'm going to go around the room here and take some questions first, then we'll pick up the online ones. So,
is there any information on how much the nitrogen and phosphorus are affected by the density of plants per acre and things of that nature, where the farmers are trying to get more plants in a given area?
I don't know that anybody's ever looked at that. I mean, the number per acre, the plant population has steadily increased. Fertilizer rates haven't increased, right? They've been the same. The amount of fertilizer we use in the state for nitrogen has been the same for 35 years now. So in one sense, agriculture is becoming more and more efficient through time because we're producing tremendously higher crops right now on the same amount of nitrogen we were applying in 1980. So that's one thing that's for the better, without a doubt. I don't know that bigger plants just can reduce sort of the kernel size and things like that. So you still it's the yield in the end that matters, not necessarily how many plants are there.
Yeah, hi. So the climate change people tell us that the likelihood of heavy precipitation events is increasing. You pointed out 1993 as a super bad year. Does your analysis have any sensitivity in terms of strategies or results as to increasing likelihood of heavy precipitation?
No, and you're exactly right. In fact, our worst year for nutrient loss was not 93, it was 2002. And that's because it was a particularly wet year, but it was storm event after storm event that was just perfect for not generating surface runoff, but tile flow. And that's actually the biggest hypoxic zone, too. It was 2002. But there's no question we have more intense and greater frequency of high rainfall events in the winter and spring. That's partially masked that I think we have made some progress, but the load for the state is so high because we've had some incredibly big storms, and particularly up in the Chicago area. And so that's a complicating factor. We acknowledge that, but that's beyond our analysis. But that makes it worse. That's what's thought to make Ohio. That's one of their big problems as well. And partially why they think some of the problems have occurred in Lake Erie is because they're getting all these late winter big storm events that they never used to get that generate tile flow and push all the phosphorus out. But no, that makes it much more difficult yet.
Hi, I was curious about, you mentioned the cost to reduce strategies and sort of the economics. You mentioned a tax on fertilizer that currently funds some programs.
Right.
But I was curious about sort of comparing those and comparing that, how much tax is collected on fertilizer versus that $1 billion per year type of idea, and the idea that phosphorus comes from ag plus humans, but the end is just all from ag and from the fertilizer load. So wait, what about sort of the cost of how much we're collecting in fertilizer tax?
Oh, the tax is absolutely tiny. Yeah, it's 75 cents per ton. So that generates $3 million a year. So
it's insignificant in comparison to the $1 billion per year.
It is.
So what's the hope that really?
That's a good question, because, and that gets into, and I've written papers on this about why they probably won't for some of these. I think it depends on the practice. If you're talking about a wetland or a bioreactor, that's just a straight cost that has no benefit, right? That's just, you got to pay for that to remove a nutrient. Somebody else will have to pay for that, whether it's federal government or state or something. Nobody's going to do those voluntarily. On the other hand, something like a cover crop or reduced tillage or things that improve your soil, improve your yield, those have some hope, I think, because you might do those just because that's going to benefit you. So I think that's the challenge. There's not enough money. That's why I don't think the edge of field will ever work on a broad scale, because there's not enough money to pay for this. I think it has to be the in-field kind of practices that people can feel like, all right, I'm doing this, to gain from this. And people have pointed out that look at all the progress we made with sediment. Well, we made a lot of progress with sediment because nobody wants to see their field erode, because that isn't loss. That is going to reduce your productivity. But nobody, losing a little bit of phosphorus or even some nitrate out your tile line, which number one, you can't see, and number two, may not have any effect on your bottom line. That's why it's a much harder sell for a lot of these things. So I think the infield practices have much, my hope would be that, and as ag gets better, that we're applying all our fertilizer, in the spring, we put some on at planting, we use a sensor to put on side dress just what the crop needs. We have fields are green most of the year with cover crops, things like that would really change things and improve the bottom line.
We've got a question. The cost per acre may be offset by ecosystem services benefits such as soil productivity, climate resilience, wildlife habitat, recreational opportunity. Has anyone calculated the value of these multiple benefits of water quality practices, recognizing that the design of the practice may need to be modified to achieve multi-sector benefits?
Yeah, well, that's a common one, the ecosystem services. The problem for the farmer is nobody's paying them for most of those ecosystem services. That gets back to my previous question or comment, that the things that, yes, if the practice improves your soil, that is a benefit. So it may have increased the organic matter, may increase then the water holding capacity, maybe it improves your yield. That's something that I think it can be a benefit. But to say that, some of these the other kinds of ecosystem services that are for this, that aren't paid for, that's nice, but farmers are, they're business people, and you can't blame them. They're growing the crop to make money, and if there's no payment for those services, I don't think that that's going to work as an incentive.
One of your first slides had the total phosphorus and nitrogen due to the flow.
Right.
Did you have a graph where you have what is the pounds per trillion gallons of water flow or something like that? Would that be a way to normalize?
Well, that was that concentration one I showed.
Okay.
And you can see those are pretty flat, right? Yeah, that's essentially taking the load divided by the flow and you get a concentration. And again, we're 4 or 5 milligrams of nitrate and 0.3 of phosphorus, and those are pretty steady through time. Yeah.
I'm interested in the relationship between the tiled lands and the non-tiled lands, and a lot of what you were saying was that, you know, let's say you're putting the same amount of fertilizer on non-tiled lands, you get far less runoff from them. Would it matter if you were holding up the water on tiled lands for a little bit longer in, let's say, the winter, fall, spring? I mean, does it have to be a microbial active time of the year? Let's say you blocked up the tile.
Well, that's the one practice. That's called drainage water management.
Okay, that's what that is.
That is a practice where you hold the water back. Part of the problem with that, and we've tried it, it's hard to retrofit on existing systems. And second, nobody really knows where the water goes, because when you open that tile, you get less water out and you get less nitrate, but where did it go? And we know in the studies we've done, it starts flowing all over the place. And so there's still, I think that's a practice that could work, but I think there's still some unknowns about that.
But increasing the time that water is on tiled lands definitely could.
Yes, in theory, but it has a negative impact. The higher you keep that water table, the more you make it subject to surface runoff, because you have less storage in the soil, and so you can actually make surface runoff. Because some of the drainage water management systems are to bring the water up within a foot of the soil surface. Well, that means you get a big rainstorm, you get more surface, so you can fix nitrate and make phosphorus and erosion worse. That's part of the problem, that some of these, like no-till, a lot of people, a lot of administrators, and let's say EPA federally, would have said a few years ago, and I've always tried to say that they're wrong, that the only two problems are that we don't have enough no-till and we just apply too much fertilizer. But no-till actually makes things move to the tile even better. And that's what they think's happened in Ohio, is that they put phosphorus on the surface. They really went to no-till to reduce erosion. That means phosphorus concentrations in that surface soil first few inches is really high. You get no-till, and you have tiles, and the big rainstorm, put climate change on top of it, and that high phosphorus water at the surface just blasts right through the tile, and that's why that's one of the leading theories of what's happened in the Lake Erie. So the other thing is these things are complicated. What you think is fixing one can actually make what's coming out the tile worse.
Are there any further questions here? Okay.